Hi, folks. Today's PowerPoint walks you through the first part of a little history of the evolution of human rights law in Ontario and Canada. So the main thing that I want to emphasize, and that I hope you all remember coming out of this class generally, is that good laws, laws that protect workers, laws that prevent discrimination, laws that provide services that people need, laws that make immigration or other services equal and get rid of discrimination in those services, they are never just because of politicians. It's not, those laws don't happen because a politician wakes up one morning and goes, hey, I have a great idea, right? What happens to bring those laws about is that activists, regular everyday people like yourself, like your family, right? They get involved and they push and they lobby and they demonstrate and they write letters and they go to meetings and they sign petitions, etc. And it is those activists that usually have the ideas for the laws. It is those activists that do the work to bring public consciousness to the need for those laws, and it is those activists that we have to thank for those laws. So it's important to understand that Canada has some of the best human rights law in the world because of those activists from a variety of ethnic communities, from the labor or union movement. And these people struggled long and hard to convince politicians and everyday Canadians that racial and other forms of discrimination are not just morally wrong, but also socially destructive, that they're the kind of thing that you actually want to legislate against. So the first law in this history of the evolution of human rights law is something called the Racial Discrimination Act. And this was passed in 1944. So this is the last year of World War II. World War II ended in 1945. And World War II was a really important turning point in terms of thinking about discrimination. It's kind of when the idea of human rights was born. And after World War II was the time when the social safety net was incredibly strengthened, when laws that supported workers and the right for income equality and the right for workers to have a say in their workplace, after World War II was the time when many of these things happened in Canada. So the Racial Discrimination Act of 1944 was designed to combat some racial discrimination. So businesses would have whites only signs in their windows or no Jews allowed signs. There was one of those in the beaches at Toronto. These were becoming increasingly unacceptable towards the end of World War II. So the Racial Discrimination Act was a pioneering statute because it's the first time that a provincial government had said that racial and religious discrimination would not be tolerated under the law. So the Racial Discrimination Act prohibits the publication or display on lands or premises by newspaper or radio of any notice, sign, symbol, emblem, or other representation indicating racial discrimination. All right, so that would have included the Nazi swastika, the sort of iconography of the Ku Klux Klan, those kinds of things all became illegal. So again, I want to emphasize, it's important to remember that we owe a lot of regular, everyday working Canadians our deep thanks for putting all sorts of their time and energy into fighting against discriminatory systems and discriminatory laws. Because as we'll hear in the video that we watch next week, before we had non-discrimination laws, there were laws that very clearly discriminated. The people in the videos that we've been watching are among the many who've won us the human rights laws that make Canada a fairer and more egalitarian country. So you want to thank the Mr. Wings. He was the guy on the motorcycle in the Shadow of Gold Mountain. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. You meet a bunch of them in the video this week. The Art Meekies. He was one of the folks who headed up the campaign for Japanese redress. The Stanley Grisels, who you've read work by this week and you will meet in a video next week. So these are the folks we want to thank for these laws. It's the politicians that often take the credit, but they're not the ones that did the hard work. This law, well, this isn't actually a law. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not a Canadian law. It is a declaration, all right? So one of the many declarations passed by the United Nations. It was passed in 1948, and it's a very important document for Canada, and that moment when it was passed was an important moment for Canadians. So in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there is this important line that says, everyone, and they mean everyone, is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. So this idea that every single human being is entitled to certain rights and freedoms, that each and every one of us deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, was a really big change in global thinking that happened after World War II, right? And it happened largely because the world sort of realized at the end of World War II what atrocities and genocide had happened during that war. And there was sort of a common understanding that there needed to be articulated some principle that sort of said we all deserve not to be killed in gas ovens. We all deserve not to be made into comfort women. And that was what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was. So in 1951, so this is 6 years after the end of World War II, the activism and tireless work of people like Hugh Burnett and his National Unity Association, you'll meet him and hear about them in our next video. These folks all worked incredibly hard to convince the Ontario Premier at the time, whose name was Leslie Frost, to introduce laws to prohibit racial discrimination. Now, Leslie Frost was a progressive, well, he was a conservative. They didn't call him progressive back then. He was a conservative premier and not the kind of fellow who you would have expected these things to come from. But Mr. Frost was a scholar of American history, and Abraham Lincoln was one of his idols. And so when Black folks repeatedly went to talk to him and say, you know, something needs to be done. All right, there is a serious problem with discrimination in this province. He passed these two laws. We'll talk about the second law next week. But in 1951, Ontario became the first jurisdiction in Canada to enact a Fair Employment Practices Act. And this became the model for the human rights codes to come. And we'll talk more about those next week. This law, the Fair Employment Practices Act, targets discrimination in hiring practices and the workplace by establishing fines as well as a procedure for complaints. So the act did have some shortcomings, some limits. It didn't apply to domestics employed in private homes, and a lot of Black women did that for work. It didn't apply to nonprofit, religious, philanthropic, educational, fraternal, or social organizations. You can just tell by the length of that list that it's a lot of exemptions. And it didn't apply to small businesses with less than 5 employees. The Canada Fair Employment Practices Act was passed in 1953, and this was basically the federal government, the government in Ottawa, following the Ontario government's lead. So the Canada Fair Employment Practices Act combats discrimination within the civil service, so basically people who are employed by the federal government. It applies to the federal government and all the sectors within the federal government's jurisdiction. So the federal government regulates interprovincial transportation and telecommunications. So the railroads, the airlines, the Bell Rogers, that kind of thing. Okay, so this law applied to all of those things. The Canada Fair Employment Practices Act aimed to eliminate discrimination by implementing fines for employers who discriminated and creating a complaint system so that people who were being discriminated against could complain. Okay, so I'm going to end this presentation here, and I will talk more about these things and tell you about more laws next week.